Hi. Okay, hopefully this is working all right. Um, so I did my stats presentation on the study habits of Lee University students. Oh, it doesn't like it when I do that. Okay, so before we get into the graphs and the analysis of the data within the graphs, I just want to do a little introduction. So first off, I want to explain the title. So my original goal when creating what I wanted to study was I wanted to study the correlation between a student's study habits and where they would choose to study on campus. But because of how the data was collected, it was a lot harder to put the habits with the spots than it was to compare and contrast the habits to each other. So I had to tweak the title to study habits instead of study spots um, to make it better reflect how I was interpreting the data. Okay, so how the data was collected. So the data was collected using a Google Forms link. By the end of the surveying period, 55 Lee students had taken the survey. Some issues that occurred from the data collection process was a lack of numerical answers. So a lot of people would just write like sentences. I really just needed a number, and so that made it a lot harder for me to interpret what they were, trying to answer. And then on top of that, not every participant answered every question. So there's some participants that only answered like two of the questions, and that makes it very hard because then we don't have a fully complete set of data. Okay, on top of that, there is somewhat of a sampling bias that happened unintentionally when I was collecting my data. Because I, the surveyor, was in charge of finding people to take my survey, a lot of them ended up having characteristics in common with me, such as being a freshman or female or an honors student or a nursing major, et cetera, because those are the people that I see and talk to and could convince to take my survey. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a super accurate reflection of the university as a whole, unfortunately, because the people who took it had things more in common with me. And obviously, I don't embody every Lee University student. Okay, so here's the graphs and data. So before we start, how I kind of divvied it up is I would do the kind of analysis part first, and then I would show the graph of how it matched up. And these are the three. For the second one, there's two different graphs that I combined together because the way that I analyzed them wasn't in coordination with each other. Okay, so the first one I'm calling concentration and comfy. So basically, what happened was I asked survey participants to rate their average concentration span while doing homework or studying and their desired level of comfy, or like how comfortable they like where they're studying to be. For example, like a bed versus like a desk chair. And then I compiled that into a linear graph in order to analyze the potential correlation between how comfy a student would like their study spot to be and how well they concentrate when studying. What I found, according to the line of best fit, is that students who prefer less comfortable study spots have a better concentration span and vice versa. But the correlation is very small. So as you'll see with the graph, even though there is a line of best fit that was calculated, the points are all over the place, and so the correlation is so small, it's not really even fair to draw a conclusion from it. See, so you can see how all the points are kind of everywhere, and so even though there is a line of best fit that is negative, the points are so far everywhere, like actually even only two of the points even cross the line, so it's kind of impossible to really make any sort of conclusion from that. Okay, so this one explores quite a few different questions, kind of in one chunk of data and an analysis of the graphs. So some of these questions are, how often do least students go home over the course of the semester? If students go home often, does it affect their schoolwork? Do students who go home over the weekend work on homework? Does going home affect a student's ability to concentrate when completing assignments? Or do they feel out of the groove? Basically, how does going home affect a student's ability to work on their schoolwork, particularly over the weekends? So in order to analyze this, I looked at two graphs. The first is a histogram showing how many times students visit home each semester. And then the second one is a linear regression graph showing the correlation between the average amount of time spent studying on the weekends and the overall concentration span of surveyed students. So all the people I got data from. So to conclude, one of the biggest things I noticed was that most students do not visit home nearly as often as I thought, usually only a maximum of 3 times a semester, which I thought was really interesting because I always thought there was more commuters and more people who regularly went home over the weekend, but according to my data, not so much. And then the correlation between time spent studying on weekends and overall concentration span is mostly inconclusive due to the difficulty of correlating those two variables. There's so many outside variables that you would have to look at to really properly correlate the two, and so the results were predominantly inconclusive. Ta-da! Yeah, so you can see how there's a lot more of the 0 to 3.1. These also have numbers attached to them, but for some reason the graph would not show them. And then here's the time spent studying on weekends and overall concentration span graph. As you can see, it is very, there's basically no trend there. It's all over the place. Okay, and so the last one is a simple pie graph showing the breakdown by year in school. So freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. And the reason that I really like this graph is because it really shows the unequal proportions that I got of survey participants. So there's definitely a sampling bias towards underclassmen, as you will notice, because most of my survey responses came from freshmen and then some sophomores. I had very little juniors and seniors. And so I kind of just wanted to wrap up with that because most of my study was just kind of this didn't quite work because type situation. So this is our year in school. And so the red is freshmen. So obviously you can't see where I'm pointing, but the good proportion of it. And then orange is sophomores. So that is well over at least 3/4 of my participants. Anyways, so yeah, that's the biggest thing there. Okay, conclusion and final thoughts. Okay, so as you may have noticed, this survey did not go at all how I'd hoped or planned it would. From start to finish, it was a lot of changing things here and editing here and trying to work with what I had. And a lot of that had to do with the way my data was collected and organized. My results ended up being messy and conclusive, and honestly, almost not interpretable. But through that, I did learn that conducting large-scale surveys and doing such surveys in a way that elicits results of value, kind of unlike mine, can be very complicated sometimes. Much more complicated than I ever would have realized. So I learned a lot. Now if I could figure out how to... Nope. Okay, how do I turn you off?